Every year, millions of people across North America celebrate the holiday known as Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May. Some believe it's Mexico's Independence Day. Others see it as a time to celebrate Mexican culture. And of course, some just want to eat some good food and dance to a mariachi band. But the true origins of the holiday might surprise you. In 1862, at the same time as the United States was torn in two, Mexico shocked the world by defeating the Imperial forces of France at the Battle of Puebla. But what were the French doing in Mexico? How did the Mexicans defeat them? And did it have any connection to the American Civil War? Well, let's turn back the clock and give a little context. In 1838, France demanded that Mexico pay them 600,000 pesos for unfair trade and damages to property owned by citizens of France. Mexico refused. So starting in November of 1838, France blockaded all major Mexican ports along the Gulf. Other than the siege of Veracruz, there was very little fighting. After 3 months, the war would end on March 9, 1839, when Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos and renew trade with France. But Mexico never paid, and France did not forget. Then, in 1857, the War of Reform pitted the liberals, who supported the reforms of the Second Mexican Republic, against the conservatives, who objected to the 1857 Constitution and wanted to restore colonial Spanish values. The liberals under President Juarez would eventually win the war in 1861. But during the course of the conflict, the conservatives had amassed a huge national debt, a debt that the new liberal government was required to pay under international law. But the new regime was bankrupt, and on July 17, 1861, the Mexican Congress voted to suspend all payments of foreign debt until something could be worked out. Britain, France, and Spain were outraged. France was still perturbed that they had not been paid the 600,000 pesos agreed upon in 1839. The British Minister to Mexico, Sir Charles Wyke, called Mexico's decision barefaced robbery. Mexico turned to the United States for help, asking for a loan. Lincoln's administration did have a vested interest in keeping Mexico afloat and keeping the Europeans out of any affairs on this side of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the American Civil War had just started in April of that same year, and the U.S. needed to focus its financial interests in winning the war at home. On October 31st, Britain, Spain, and France signed the Convention of London, 1861, in which all three powers agreed to send troops to occupy Veracruz until a settlement with Mexico was negotiated. It was intended to be a joint operation, so none of them would appear to be a lone empire seeking to conquer Mexico. On December 8th, the Spanish would land their troops in Veracruz and capture the city without bloodshed. Mexican President Benito Juarez decided not to engage the Europeans, but instead set up a perimeter, effectively blockading the city from any inland routes. On January 8, 1862, the rest of the Allies would follow, and all three nations began negotiations with the Mexican government. Though Britain and Spain were owed far more than France, they were not interested in pressing the conflict further than a military occupation. But both were alarmed when French diplomat Pierre Cellini made threats to escalate the situation into a full-scale war. Before the Allied nations had signed the Convention of London, the Emperor of France had already decided to use the crisis to seize power on the North American continent. The Emperor's name was Napoleon. No, not that Napoleon. His nephew, Napoleon III. He had become president of the Second French Republic in 1848 before proclaiming himself emperor in 1852. He tried to emulate his uncle, building his empire into Africa and French Indochina. But he also wanted to extend his reach to the other side of the Atlantic. The international crisis in Mexico, coupled with the ongoing American Civil War, gave him the perfect opportunity. Sending his troops with Britain and Spain under the disguise of seeking a settlement was intended as a cover for allowing his army to gain a foothold in Mexico's largest port. He could then draw support from the embittered conservatives in Mexico, and after taking control of the capital, proclaim his royal relative, Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, as emperor. of Mexico. After that, the French could circumnavigate the Union blockade of the southern U.S. and send supplies directly to the Confederacy. And if they won the war, it would end the United States hegemony on the continent. On March 6, France landed more troops in Veracruz. With them came two generals, Charles Latreille, the Count of Lorraine, who would take control of the French army in Mexico, and Juan Almonte, a leader of the conservative Mexican army in the War of Reform. In April, Britain and Spain began removing their troops from Veracruz after they had negotiated a deal with Mexico. Unsurprisingly, France stayed. On April 28th, after making proclamations to establish a new Mexican government, the French army finally began its march on Mexico City. Before leaving, Spanish General Juan Prim had commented that the French forces, which were between 6,000 to 7,000 men, were not enough to take Puebla, let alone the capital of Mexico. But Pierre Cellini, along with Juan Almonte, assured General Lorraine that his army was sufficient for the task. They were convinced that a French army could march on Mexico City with little resistance and the country would be theirs. But even just marching was not a simple task. The tropical heat, the rough terrain, and underbrush full of cactus was completely foreign to the French army that was composed of troops who were used to fighting in Europe and North Africa. The Mexican army stubbornly refused to engage the French in an open field battle, instead picking to skirmish the French along the way. It was on May 4th that Lorraine and his army arrived on the outskirts of Puebla. Any attack on the capital of Mexico had to pass through this city, and as you can see from this map, the city is surrounded by forts, walls, and other defensive positions that Mexican Republican troops could use to counter the French from almost any angle. However, the residents of the city were supporters of the conservative movement in Mexico and actually were rooting for the French to win the battle. This led the French high command to believe that the people of Puebla might rise up against the Mexican defenders as soon as the battle began. But this turned out to be only a pipe dream. Opposing Lorraine was Mexican General Ignacio Zaragoza and between 5,000 to 6,000 troops. It was only slightly less than the French army, but the French were also expecting further reinforcements from General Marquez and his 2,500 Imperialista troops. Further, the French believed that they had the best army in the world, and that the Mexicans would flee from them in a pitched battle. Conversely, Zaragoza had doubts about the French army's reputation, but more importantly, he had the high ground. Lorraine had too few troops to conduct a proper siege, so he called a council of war to plan his attack. General Almonte, the Mexican advisor to French General Lorraine, had fought here 4 times during the War of Reform. There was one thing he knew: no army had ever taken Puebla by attacking it from the north. On this side was Guadalupe Hill, crowned by 2 forts, Fort Guadalupe, which was originally a convent, and Fort Loreto. Other officers suggested attacking from the south. Diplomat Cellini, who had followed the army from Veracruz, advised that they should attack from the east, but attacking from the south meant stretching the French supply lines and risk being cut off from the coast. Going in on the east meant fighting through the city block by block, and the guns on top of Guadalupe Hill would still be able to rain down fire on Lorraine's troops. So he made a bold decision: attack from the north. Before continuing, I wanted to let you know about an exciting upcoming video I have in the works. Last December, I put out a Christmas special, a war game on the Battle of Trenton. Well, I have another wargaming video coming out on this very battle, the Battle of Puebla. It takes a lot of effort to put these videos together, and I do have a full-time job, so as for the timing, all I can say is that it will be posted on the channel soon. Anyways, back to the video. On May 5th, everything that could go wrong for the French did. First, Lorraine received a message that General Marquez and his 2,500 Imperialista troops were ambushed 30 miles from Puebla and would not make it in time for the battle. But the French carried on with the attack anyways, taking their time to get into position. Zaragoza was surprised to see the French moving to attack him from the north. Quickly, he redeployed his troops, bringing 2 brigades and half of his cavalry just behind the ridge of the hill between the 2 forts. The French opening bombardment started at 11 a.m. At 12:30 p.m., Lorenzo received news that the guns had already used up half their ammunition and would be out of ammo within the hour. Somehow, the French hadn't bothered to bring enough artillery shells to sustain a full-on battle. So with no more reasons for delay, Lorenzo ordered the attack to commence. The French Zouaves battalion led the first assault up Guadalupe Hill. Coming under heavy musketry and cannonade fire, the famed North African troops were soundly repulsed. Reserves were committed for a second attack on the hill, this time with a diversionary action east of Guadalupe towards the town. This resulted in fierce hand-to-hand combat, but Mexican zapadores and other Republican troops repulsed this assault as well. At this point, the French cannon fell silent, being completely out of ammunition. Probably thinking that 3 times was the charm, Lorenzo ordered a third assault on Guadalupe Hill. There is a report that a French standard-bearer made it to the top of the wall at Fort Guadalupe and planted his tricolor flag, but he was quickly cut down and the flag removed. Sensing the moment was right, Zaragoza ordered a counterattack, sending in his cavalry on the flanks and reserves in the middle. The French were routed from the hill. At 3 p.m., a thunderstorm began to downpour on the battlefield. By 4 p.m., the ground was so slippery that Lorenzo was forced to withdraw, thus ending the battle. Zaragoza decided that he had had enough as well and did not press the French retreat. French historians would report their side suffered 462 casualties, which included dead, wounded, and missing. The Mexican sources claim that at least 1,000 French were killed. Mexican casualties are estimated at somewhere between 300 and 500. The resounding victory was a surprise to everyone, no more so than the Mexicans. The troops began celebrating and singing. One of the songs they sung was Les Marseillaises. It was the national anthem of the French Revolution. But when Napoleon III had returned the country to an empire, he had the song banned. Now it was played by the Mexicans to taunt the French army they had just humiliated. General Lorenzo bore the brunt of the blame for the defeat and was dismissed from his command. But you could also blame diplomat Pierre Cellini and General Juan Almonte. Both had foolishly encouraged Lorenzo to press from Mexico City in the mistaken belief that the Mexican Republican Army would show little resistance. Interestingly, the best advice had come from Spanish General Juan Prim, who predicted that the French army needed at least 20,000 more men to take Puebla. A year later, in March of 1863, France would return to Puebla with an army just shy of 30,000 strong. After a 2-month siege, the city would fall, and Mexico City would be captured soon afterwards. The next year, Maximilian would be crowned the Emperor of Mexico. Now, at first glance, it would seem that the Mexican victory on the 5th of May did nothing more than delay the inevitable. But some historians have speculated that the extra year it took for France to wrest control of Mexico's capital may have sealed the fate for the Confederate States of America. Just a month after France took Mexico City, the Union would capture Vicksburg, effectively cutting off any hope of the southern states receiving support from the French by land. The victory also gave the Mexicans hope that they could persevere through the conflict and eventually win back their homeland. After the North won the American Civil War, the once again United States put their support behind the Mexican Republicans and pressured Napoleon III to remove his troops from Mexico. Having never fully wrested control of the country and not wanting to escalate the conflict any further, Napoleon III would pull the last French troops from Mexico in June of 1867. At the same time, Emperor Maximilian was deposed and executed. The Mexican Republic was restored. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, consider pressing the like button and subscribing. If you didn't, well, I appreciate you making it this far anyways. And don't forget to check out my upcoming video, Wargaming the Battle of Puebla, coming soon. Thanks again.